All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us for the launch of our 7th edition of our import duty investigation report. And the zombie theme, as you can see, is going to dominate this conversation. And we're calling it the tariff zombies simply because we have so many tariff investigations that are open, that decisions are never taken on, but they also are never terminated. They are truly the undead, if you like. So let's kind of kick off with the big findings. I'm going to leave quite a lot of time for the panel discussion and to take questions. And of course, if there's anything we can answer for you guys, we'd be more than happy to do so. So let me start with the very first big finding. I think it is fair to say that 64 months is too long to complete a tariff investigation, and yet that is what we are currently sitting with. So the oldest open investigation, if you look at the line chart, that number at the top is 64. That is 64 months old. In the early part of the new year, that investigation will turn 6 years old. If you were a child that is old enough for you to start school, and if you're in South Africa in a rural school, to possibly drown in a pit latrine. So 64 months is very, very old. On average, a tariff investigation will now be open for 27 months. Now, the promise made is that a tariff investigation should wrap up in 6 months. And I've seen many familiar faces that are joining us today. This chart would look familiar to you, except that line at the top is just truly becoming quite frightening. Now, for most of ITAC's existence, which is 22 years now, investigations on average were wrapping up somewhere around the 6-month mark. There was some concern raised around 2011, when they said, look, we're becoming a little bit worried with this business of investigations having a target of 12 months. They're taking too long to complete. We're going to bring that down to a 6-month period. And the problem, as you can see, from around 2019, just the system completely breaks at that point. And investigations take longer and longer. Now, in the past, that problem was heavily concentrated on the ministers. So just to explain how this works, when a decision is taken by the commission at ITAC, they send their recommendation to the Minister of Trade. And the Minister of Trade then applies his mind. And when he arrives at a decision, he can either send it back to ITAC and say, well, I'm not so happy about this, I need you to look at something else. Or he can take a decision and he could say, all right, I'm gonna change this duty. And he then goes to the Minister of Finance and he says, would you please increase, decrease, whatever the case might be, this decision. And the Minister of Finance then takes his decision. He tells SARS, I want you to go ahead and to make this duty change. Now, all of that used to wrap up in a 6-month period. And there would be the odd straggler. Sometimes a case would run for 12 months. But really, the bulk of the time was at ITAC. And typically at ITAC, you would see a case linger for around 4 months or so. And then the rest of the time with the two ministers. And then that started coming apart. But right now, the average amount of time is 18 months at ITAC. So I say here, 18 months at ITAC is simply also too long. So let's just quickly have a look at this chart. So the bottom horizontal line that you see through the chart, that is the 6-month line. And the higher chart, that is 12 months. And we would argue that 12 months is about as much time as it should take to wrap up a case. Even though the promise made in the policy document available on ITAC's website is 6 months, if it is going to take a while, it really should wrap up in 12 months. what we see here is, on average, at the moment, it is spending about 18 months at ITAC. And so even if you accept that it could take quite long to finish an investigation, 18 months at ITAC is simply too long. Somewhat ironically, we are seeing a reversal of the situation. So the investigations are starting to spend less time with the ministers. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because the investigation is really, the bulk of that work has been done at ITAC. So the good news is the amount of time with the ministers is decreasing, but we're not in a good position if that is being offset by the investigation now taking longer at ITAC. Having said all of that, this is not to suggest ITAC should rush these things. We understand that these can be complicated cases, but even the most complicated tariff investigation should never be sitting for 18 months with ITAC. And so that time, of course, has to come down. But all of this in this case, in this report, is certainly not all bad news. And so what we are seeing is private sector participation is improving. And so if you look at this report over here, one of the concerns we had is that the private sector was disengaging from the process. So if you have a look at this period over here, where you've got the 2312, you can see that area over there where my cursor is hovering at present. We got down to just 2 tariff applications, which was the lowest we'd been in a 6-month period in 20 years. That has started increasing. Now, whether it's good to have a large or a small number of applications, what we can reasonably say is, at a time where there's some level of economic distress, we should reasonably expect to see the number of those cases rise. Remember, this chart is not looking at whether companies are applying for more or less protection. We're simply saying that they're approaching government back to a level that was kind of seen before. And so I think for the most part, that is good. Of course, it doesn't help if you're approaching government and then 5 years later, you still don't have a decision on your case. So that certainly is not good. Now, you can imagine, because these cases are not getting cleared, a very large backlog is developing. And so in order to clear the backlog, the old cases need to receive more attention. That is not the case. And so what we're finding is the rate of completion, the number of cases being finalized, remains still worryingly low. So if we look at the ratio of cases that are younger than 6 months versus the number of cases being finalized, we need to, this backlog is never going to get cleared if it's not given some specific attention. The next big observation in our report is the stickiness of tariffs. And so let me quickly explain what we look at here. So there was an interesting paper published by Professor Danny Roderick in 2002 on industrial policy. I should have in fact included the quote in here, but roughly speaking, he says, look, if you're going to give a subsidy or a tariff to an industry to support them in some way, you need to bake the termination of that support into the rules up front, so that when you give support, it does not stick around forever. And we know that ITAC have taken this on board, because in the last decade or so, almost every single time they increase duties, they say after 3 years, after 5 years in some cases, these duties need to be revisited. Now, sometimes they are, but they almost never are. So it truly is an exception when they are re-looked at. It is not the norm. And so what we find is that 93.5% of all tariff codes have simply not been reviewed in more than 20 years. So what this means is there is a tariff code, it attracts a duty, so it is not duty-free, and 93% of the time, a tariff code with a duty will not be reviewed in more than 20 years. Our cutoff here is a little bit arbitrary, but simply because it's hard to gather data before ITAC came into existence. And so many of these tariff codes with a duty are legacy tariffs. They've been inherited by ITAC, but they're not getting looked at. And so for some of these, we would say, well, you know, we have a clothing industry. It's got a high tariff. It's 45%. Everyone knows the clothing industry is struggling. And that may or may not be true, but a significant portion of the tariffs that are currently in place are in fact in place on intermediate products. So intermediate products are products which are used in a manufacturing process by someone else. So think of all of the steel tariffs you've been reading about in the media recently. Those steel tariffs are not on finished goods for the most part. They are on the intermediate products. And that means everyone that consumes the steel or everyone that consumes the chemicals that have a tariff on, all of them are going to be faced with a more expensive raw material. And so that has important implications for the downstream industry. The next big finding that we have is that rebates have pretty much replaced duty removal when there is no domestic production. So if you have a look over here, you can see in 2023-06, that was the last time a duty was simply removed. Since then, whether or not there is a domestic producer, in fact, if there is a domestic producer, you'll not be allowed the duty relief. But if there is no domestic producer, you will now be given a rebate of duty. That has very important implications into the future, because unlike with the duty removal, where you know that your raw material that you can't buy locally is now duty-free, the replacement of that with the temporary rebate means that you need to go to ITAC every 6 months, 3 months, year, depending on what the product is, and you need to get a permit. And that permit can not be issued. We've just seen a situation recently on a product chemical called titanium dioxide, where that rebate has now ended. So we still don't have domestic production of the product. There is a factory that is being set up, but they're still not running. But you can no longer get the rebate of duty on that raw material. And so this is the nub of why we have a concern about rebates replacing duty reduction. The second problem is it takes time for permits to be issued. And so with a permit, you are not guaranteed of a duty reduction. It can take a while. Some permits are issued within 2 weeks. Some can take a month. Some are taking longer. And we're finding within our own client base, at least, that companies are needing to place an order. They need the raw material in their factory. They can't wait forever for it. And so what is happening is they're going ahead, placing the order. The goods are arriving. They don't have the permit. They need to pay the duty. Now, of course, they can still get a permit issued. ITAC would typically backdate that permit, but they're not obliged to do that. And so that can turn into quite a lot of money. Now, the number of rebates has shot through the roof. And this was kind of led with the steel sector, which now has over 80 temporary rebates on all sorts of products. When you replace a duty removal with a rebate, you add complexity. So if you take steel, for example, we now have incredibly complicated rebates. And when you have complexity, you open the door for circumvention. And so certainly in the steel sector, we've seen, it's not covered in this report, but we do some very interesting work to identify circumvention of duties. And something that has become just absolutely apparent is as you increase the complexity, you increase the probability that someone is going to take a chance and try to not pay the correct duty. And that obviously penalizes legitimate traders and the domestic industry. Because there are so many permits that are currently being issued, ITAC will be introducing, probably in the new year, a charge for every permit to be issued so that they can employ more people. And so we're ending up with more and more permits being required. As you have more permits, ITAC needs more people to assess the permit applications. And so you've got this kind of stealth tax that begins creeping into the process. The other way import control is creeping in is under the guise of national security. So with the very big steel review that is currently ongoing, explicitly stated in that review is that ITAC wishes to invoke Article 21 of the GATT. And Article 21 is a national security provision. We do not believe it can legitimately be invoked in this particular case, but that is my opinion. To be clear, not necessarily the opinion of my fellow panelists here today. But in this scenario, we are not looking at import control to determine whether or not you have to pay a duty. We are looking at import control, which determines whether you can or cannot do the import. In other words, if you don't have the permit, you will not be allowed to bring the goods into the country. And we see this certainly as quite a large threat. We will have to see on implementation how it looks. I'm hoping it does not proceed. But if import control in this way is going to be normalized, we are going to find a lot more difficulty in just moving goods across borders. We run a risk of retaliation from other countries. So certainly from my personal perspective, I don't see this as a good development. But we'll discuss it with my fellow panelists after this and get their take. And then, as always, we know in South Africa, you can't get anything done if you don't have a master plan. And so, of course, we have a master plan. Ours is a little less verbose than most of the others you would have seen. But let me just quickly go through what we propose be done to improve this process. The one is to simply review the duties which are overdue for review. We have a long list of them. If anyone wants them, we're very happy to provide it. But we have a list which have been identified by ITAC, for review. They are in most cases many years overdue. We like to see those reviews happen. The second issue is get rid of reciprocal agreements. These are the agreements you are required to sign before you can get your duty change. They bind you for 3 years. You will be required to potentially employ more people, spend more money on training, do more, invest a greater amount into your factory if you have one, commit to doing more exports, etc. So these reciprocal agreements create a very strangely personalized tariff policy situation where individual companies are being asked to sign these agreements. The fact that we no longer remove duties and we've replaced them with temporary rebates also means that to get a permit, you are often being required to sign such an agreement. So if you want the concession, you need to sign up. But if we are going to keep them, we believe non-confidential versions of them need to be made available. This is not the norm at the moment, but the secret agreements we do not think sets a good example at all. We think because 64 months is an insane amount of time to complete an investigation, that the tariff regulations themselves need to be amended to force legal time limits on tariff investigations. We already have this for things like anti-dumping cases, which have a built-in 18-month cutoff. At the end of 18 months, if the case is not finished, it automatically terminates. We could see no downside to implementing such a rule. We believe that ITAC needs to publish its investigation report as soon as the investigation is finished. In other words, at that point, an administrative decision has been taken by the Commission. We could see no reason why that recommendation cannot be published at that point. And we also think in the case of duty increases, we need to publish into the regulations a review date so that we don't end up in a situation where the reviews are supposed to happen, but in reality, they never happen. And these duties just kind of linger forever. We've added a number 5 to our recommendation, which is to not use national security as a reason for protectionism or excuse for protectionism. This direction of travel, we think, ends very poorly. At that point, I am done. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand over to Mbongeni, and I'm going to put my camera on. So, Mbongeni, over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Donald and Anneke, for another great and comprehensive report. I'm joined, in addition to Donald and Anneke, I'm joined this afternoon by a colleague, Dr. Matthew Stern. He's a director at DNA Economics and also the head of trade and regional integration. Afternoon, Matthew.
Hi, I'm Mbongeni. Afternoon, everyone.
Thanks. So, yeah, we're going to touch on a few points, and I think that stick out on this report. The way I'd perhaps like to structure it, I think let's speak a bit about the process of investigation. So the challenges that we're seeing in terms of these backlogs and zombie tariffs, the permits and rebates system. And then I think we'll have another discussion about where's our trade policy going? This protectionism, especially in the context, I think the colleagues on the call would be interested in the context of Trump and geopolitical tensions. Where should we be going from a policy perspective? And then to try and end off with some practical and implementable solutions to address this. So maybe Matthew, just let's start by unpacking. What do you see are the challenges in terms of these backlogs? What kind of damage are they doing for the South African economy in your perspective from DNA Economics?
Thanks, Mbongeni. And firstly, big thanks and shout out to Donald, Anneke, and the team at XA for a graphic and terrifying report, and for the even more terrifying graphics. And so for those of you who have not read it, please download it, if only to check out the pictures. Mbongeni, I think for the findings from the report as Donald has presented are clear. The system, the structure is in place for reviewing tariff applications in South Africa appears to be broken, or at least severely damaged, and is not working very well for industry, but I suspect is also not working very well for government. I think in trying to understand the problem and what impact it's having, it's important not to underplay the complexity involved in making these kind of very product-specific policy decisions. There are inevitably multiple parties involved. The commercial implications, the costs and benefits for different parties are immediate and severe. There are always going to be winners and losers. And there's a whack load of heavy lobbying that ITAC and others are confronted with on a daily basis. So, we have to have a little bit of sympathy for ITAC for the very difficult role and responsibilities that have been dumped on them. But in stepping back a little bit, I think there are two key questions that jump out at me in trying to think through the economic and policy consequences. I mean, the first is a bit of an esoteric question, but it's why are we doing all of this? And I worry that adopting a piecemeal, a tariff-line approach to trade policy is sending the wrong kind of signals to business, is not particularly strategic. And as a result, we have a tariff book that is littered with duties that reflect the peculiarities of very specific companies at specific points in time, many of which, as Donald has rightly pointed out, might now be obsolete. And the second question is why have we made this ITAC's problem? Should ITAC be assuming responsibility for these kind of big trade policy decisions and the economic consequences that flow from them?
Yeah, I think those are great questions, and just reflecting on the complexity point. If you benchmark, for example, some other tariff approach in other markets, you'd have, for example, a 2 or 3-tiered tariff regime, and here we have this very, very complex tariff book that I mean, the distinction that Donald made between intermediate, final, and gross fixed capital formation, we're not making that distinction in the way that we approach tariffs. And I understand the idea that over time there would be some attempt to be more sophisticated, I guess. But can the states and the state institutions really implement this very well? I mean, Donald, to go back, just reflect a bit again on the permit system and what kind of rules and regulations are required. I know the report speaks a bit about the clothing example. Can you just reflect on that, and why would that be, for example, a challenge for players or firms in that industry?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The problem with permits generally, and the way our legislation is currently written, is the rules that you apply to issuing a permit are pretty much whatever at present ITAC wants them to be, or the minister wants them to be. Yeah. So they're unpredictable. If we look at the clothing permits, I mean, effectively what you've got is an incentive scheme that was created to try to stimulate demand in the clothing and textile value chain. They do this by saying, we will give you duty relief on your textile raw material. And there's quite a big duty on textiles at 22.5% on average. So you get to not pay that duty, but to get that permit issued that allows you to not pay the duty, you then need to make a commitment to buy a certain volume of product from South African textile producers. You have to be a member of the bargaining council. You may not sell the clothing that you manufacture to a retailer that is not a signatory to the master plan. There are 7 of those that are signatories. You may not export it outside of the country that you produce in. So if you're a producer in Lesotho, which is of course part of the customs union, you cannot obtain that benefit and export your clothing into South Africa. I mean, you also can't comply with it because the concept of a bargaining council is purely South African. So the whole situation has become very, very complicated around that particular rebate. Now, we could argue, well, that's a good thing. We'd like to shift more of that production out of Lesotho into South Africa. But I think if you make that assumption, firstly, it's not clear to me that that is a good assumption to make. But if you do make that assumption, you are not going to have the lady that worked as a seamstress in Lesotho relocating to Texas to go work for SpaceX. She's going to bring her family, walk over the border, and potentially, move into South Africa. So the intention, whatever it might be behind that, we've now ended up with an unbelievably complicated rebate and permit that is very difficult to comply with.
Matthew, let's unpack your second point, right? You're saying why ITaC? Why should ITaC be doing this? Take us through what you understand the role should be for ITaC, and why it's problematic that ITaC, for example, is having more and more discretion in these kinds of decisions.
Cool. Yeah, so the role that ITaC assumes is given to it by the Act and the legislation, and it's in its own guidelines. ITaC, clearly asserts this policy type role. Its investigations are not just administrative. They need to account for sector-specific situations. As Donald has mentioned, there's increased emphasis on reciprocal deals where ITaC engages with industry to get something back in return for a tariff reduction or increase. The guidelines require ITaC to take a developmental and strategic approach to customs tariffs, to be sensitive to employment and other economic outcomes. And so the mandate and the way that ITaC plays a role in determining or applying its mind to tariff decisions includes a significant policy orientation and policy focus. And so in looking a little bit at how other countries did this, I had a quick scan. I had a look around at Australia, Canada, and India, just as examples. And the authorities in these countries that are responsible for administering the tariff or administering the customs process have a very specific and defined role, which is all about anti-dumping. It's all about safeguards. They do not have the capacity or the competency to be adjusted or to be tweaking the tariff on a daily or a monthly on an annual basis. That's a trade policy role that is generally delegated upwards to either Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Trade or an economic ministry. And so, yeah, we need to think about the role that ITaC could or should not play, not just in administering the tariff, not just in doing its core duties, which should be all about absolutely protecting us from unfair protection or dumping, but also need to reconsider or rethink whether ITaC should be also assuming a more active role in the determination of trade policy.
Thanks. Just to change tack a bit, I want to talk a bit about Donald, this import control. Now you've painted a picture a bit about how this is going in the steel sector. Just elaborate a bit on how the national security has been involved in that sector, and why we should be concerned about this.
Yeah. So, yeah, no, I think we should be concerned. I certainly am concerned. So let me maybe just make this my problem and not tell everyone else what to think. But my concern here is on a few fronts. The first is the general agreement on tariffs and trade under Article 21 gives a very specific set of conditions where you can invoke national security. Let's be, for example, there's a war or there's a terrorist attack. Those sorts of things are the typical reasons you can trigger it. Now, you might have noticed that President Trump in the US has become quite enthusiastic about invoking national security. And we've seen it in the US. That takes the form of what are called Section 232 tariffs. And we've got like a 50% on steel, copper, and so on. We're basically following
EVs and EV batteries and that kind of thing.
That's right, and cars and all sorts of stuff. So we have a very similar kind of thinking here, and the thinking locally seems to be, as far as we can tell, if we invoke this, we by invoking that, if it's legitimate, you can bypass your obligations under GATT. And these obligations, for example, are that you can't impose import control unless it is to safeguard human health, animal health, plant health. So think, for example, of the importation of pharmaceutical products. You can't just do that. you need to get a permit. Or to import cement, you need a permit because you don't want a building to collapse because the cement is not produced to the right standard and so on. That is not what is being proposed here. What is being proposed here is a general purpose import control. So this would mean if I wanted to import a particular piece of steel, unrelated to whether there's a safety concern on that type of steel, I am going to put import control. If ITAC does not issue you with a permit, it means you will not be allowed to import that steel. So this is not you import it and pay a duty, you will not be allowed to bring it in. Now, this has been proposed for the first time in this very large steel review, but there's no reason to think if it happens here that this does not become something that is expanded to other areas. So we could very quickly see import control on chicken to say, not that we're concerned there's a pathogen in the chicken, but we think too much chicken is coming in, or insert whatever that product might be. And I hate the idea of slippery slope arguments, but I think this is a good example of where that will become a very convenient tool to use to protect domestic producers.
So there might be some in the audience who say, look, you've given the examples of what's happening in the US under Trump. This is just the sort of trade policy of the day. There's a move towards protectionism. We're seeing that countries are trying to protect domestic industries. And so why shouldn't South Africa follow in that wave? I'm going to open the questions to both of you to say, within the current context, what approach should we be taking in managing tariffs and industrial protection? I'll go back to you, Donald, and then Matthew. Yeah.
Well, not every idea of Donald Trump, it turns out, is a good idea, and I don't think this is a particularly good idea for America or the rest of the world. The problem that you end up with is the minute you go down the road of every country separating from everyone else, it is not long before our exports also can't enter other countries. This does not only happen in one direction. So the idea that we could do this and everyone else would be okay with it, it's just that doesn't make any sense to me. So, the reason GATT and then later on the WTO came into existence was in large part to avoid this kind of situation. And, I would argue the world has mostly benefited from the ability to move goods around the world easier. If we kind of revert back to a 1930 type model, I think we all just become poorer for it. So I'm not suggesting there would be no winners. Of course there would be winners, but I think on balance, South Africa is worse off if we are okay with this as a economic strategy. I'd love to hear what Matthew thinks, though.
Matthew?
Yeah, thanks, Mbongeni. Yeah, so I mean, broadly agree with Donald. I mean, what Trump has done domestically and to the world is extremely damaging and concerning. He's done it for his own and peculiar reasons, and on the understanding, rightly or wrongly, that he believes he can either attract investment that has left the States back in order to rebuild industry, or that he can somehow resuscitate industries that have declined or deteriorated in the US. And the only thing that the US does have going for it remains, for the moment, a very large economy, and has a very large consumer base. And so in some cases, he might get away with being able to recreate or rebuild domestic industry. South Africa is a very different situation. We are a very small economy at the southern tip of Africa. We have a very small and not a deeply wealthy consumer base. And so it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to build or develop an economy by sitting to ourselves. We need to export in order to grow, and we need to export to build the kind of scale and capacity that's necessary in order to create jobs and develop. And so, if we're going to impose controls, taxes, duties, quotas, we need to think very hard about what it is that we're trying to solve for. What is the policy problem that we're trying to address? If the problem is that we are deeply worried about cheap steel that is washing around the world because it can't get into America and it's been subsidized by the Chinese or the Turks, and we can demonstrate that it is being subsidized and that it's harming South African producers. There are remedies in place to address those particular kinds of challenges as and when they arise. If we are determined to build a particular sector or industry because for whatever reason we believe over the short term by providing temporary protection that industry can grow and become globally competitive, then there might be specific instances where trade support, subsidies, or tariffs may be warranted in the short term, but not indefinitely. But those cases are likely to be very limited and they need to be well justified. If we are worried about health or safety concerns, as Donald has indicated, well, then some kind of controls might be useful. But again, those should only be applied in very specific situations. Applying tariffs bluntly or controls bluntly in order to try and address all of these concerns, is risky. It will raise the cost of importing and doing business in South Africa, and none of this will do anything to support or grow exports.
Yeah, I think you both make compelling points. Many of our most successful industrial sectors, such as the automotive industry, have benefited from their export orientation. We have large multinationals, some coming from those export destinations, and so from a competitiveness perspective, closing up our economy really doesn't support that. I mean, there are cases, some would argue about where there is a domestic demand sufficient maybe to have competitiveness, but often the challenge there is that these smaller companies, I think Donald made the point, the smaller companies are not going to be able to keep up with all the compliance costs. So it also becomes uncompetitive in a sense that you're not actually creating open competition for those industries. You are basically privileging a few players within the market. So it's definitely concerning that that we're going in that direction. Are there some international? You've spoken a bit about some of the international cases that you've seen. Is there sort of like a benchmark or a country that we should be looking at, Matthew, that should be informing our direction going forward?
Difficult question in current global context, Mbongeni.
Yeah.
But yeah, a country that I've always looked at is Australia, and not just because they're bad at rugby, but because when it comes to economic policy decisions, and particularly trade policy decisions, they've been relatively innovative. They also are, like us, historically a commodity-based economy, so they've grown up on the back of a mining industry. They've invested in or experimented with the same kind of industries that we have in South Africa, but they've made quite bold policy decisions when things are not going right and been able to get out of those industries which are not working. And they've managed to develop a very successful services industry, which is very much orientated around their mining industry, but is also globally competitive. What's quite unique in Australia is that they converted their equivalent of ITAC into a productivity commission. So they swung it around and challenged the authority or the agency to instead take an economy-wide approach and to review and to assess tariffs, but all other policies in order to determine what will do best, what will help most in order to raise the competitiveness and the productivity of Australian business, rather than how to protect or insulate Australian business from global winds and forces. And that Productivity Commission still on an annual basis produces a review. It reviews all tariffs. So unlike ITAC, which we're told has not reviewed many or most of its tariffs and is able to assess 6 or 7 applications a year, the Productivity Commission assesses the full range of tariffs across Australian industry, assesses the costs and benefits as they apply to the entire economy, and makes recommendations to government on how tariff, trade, and industrial policy can best be served to benefit not just industry, but consumers and the broader economy. Yeah, so I think as a relatively small mining-orientated but quite open economy with a very good policy and evidence base, Australia is sometimes worth a watch.
It's very interesting, and I mean, Donald, we've spoken about this before in the past. Say, if not protectionism and import substitution, then what? And is the export orientation should that be the focus? And under that kind of focus, what kind of trade policy and tariff review system would you envisage?
Yeah, so I think exports and being export focused has a couple of interesting side effects that are useful. The one is you are not sitting comfortably in a protectionist environment, which means whatever you produce for an export market, you have to be very good at doing. So it's just kind of it's a way of keeping you competitive.
Discipline.
Yes, I think it's a good idea. Now, it doesn't mean that every factory in South Africa has got to be export focused, but I think where government is going to intervene, you want to intervene in a way that is going to help a particular sector that can have a large economic impact to be competitive. When you have a factory that is competitive globally, they're also competitive locally, and so there should be positive effects on the local economy. I think the defining characteristic of our trade policy is we're increasingly supporting companies and sectors which we don't want the sun to go down on them. Now, I mean, sometimes it's not the company's fault. If you don't have electricity, that's not your fault, and you may be faced going out of business. But I am concerned at times that tariffs become an alternative to fixing the underlying problem rather than in the role that they should play. So when you've got a tariff in place for 20 years, all you've done is you've just enabled a rent. And in South Africa, because our economy is so concentrated, that rent will very often only go to one company or maybe two at a push. And so in that environment, my concern is all we're doing is we're locking in high levels of concentration. We are not leaving room for innovation and new ideas because the protection keeps going to the same group of companies. Mbongeni, sorry, just to also add, please note we do have some questions from the audience that are starting to pop up. So I just want to make sure we leave time to address their concerns too.
Absolutely, yeah, I've noticed that. Thanks. Yeah, I actually wanted to speak to some of these questions. So the first is put forward by an anonymous attendee asking about what are the number of cases that have been received by ITAC, and is it possible that from 2019, and is it possible that COVID-19 basically has become the issue, and that has complicated tariff decisions given the current fluidity of global trade? Nadia, Would you like to respond to that? Or is that Anneke?
It'll be
That is
Anneke.
me.
Yes, Anneke, go ahead.
I have the data already. So in
Sure.
2019, we saw 14 cases initiated. Then 2020 and 2021 was 20 and 25 cases each. And then we saw the dip after 2022 for, so 2023 and 4, only 9 cases in each year. And then 2024, 13, and this year so far, we have 7. So we're definitely seeing a drop-off after, I think that's actually after COVID, yes.
Yes.
Mm.
So at the height of COVID, we saw the most cases initiated.
No. Which sort of makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so I guess the second part of the question is trying to say post-COVID, aren't we just seeing a protectionism post-COVID because of maybe because of the global economy, maybe because of supply chain disruptions?
No.
We may have partly answered that, but Donald, yeah.
No, absolutely not. There is a very direct relationship to the change in pattern connected to who the policymaker was at the time. So it's not accidental. We see in 2021, then Minister Patel actually puts out a public notice saying, we're going to be more interventionist. We're going to make sure that we get something back when we give something to people. These are written policies that are released. So I think what we end up seeing is a direct outcome of an internal policy shift. I don't think, I'm not saying that the global issues did not perhaps create reason for the minister to have that view, but we have a very deliberate written policy shift that we can see.
Yeah, it was the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition and the minister who took that decision. Not necessarily that we're just following a global trend. Matthew, I think I'd like to ask you to respond to this next question. It's saying, just to summarize, ITAC still remains the best institution to perform the function that they are performing. Is it not just that they're undercapacitated and that capacity would deal with this issue? And then on the issue of reciprocal commitments or permits or rebates, is it not just that these things should be made sector-wide as opposed to for individual companies? So is it not, does that not just solve the issue of these reciprocal commitments? Do you have comments on those?
Cool. Let me start on the first part, and then I might throw the second part over to Donald. To start on ITAC's capacity, I can't comment specifically on ITAC's capacity, but what I did want to clarify is, I didn't want to or dare suggest that ITAC doesn't have a really important role to play in terms of the administration and implementation of trade remedies. That's a core and critical function of ITAC. And where there are clear cases where countries are dumping or there are cases of unfair trading practices, ITAC has a key role to play in investigating, estimating the scale of those damages, and implementing the necessary actions to protect South African industry from unfair or highly subsidized production from elsewhere. And that role is going to unfortunately become even more critical in the coming years as global supply chains get severely disrupted by whatever comes out of America, as exporters are looking for new markets to sell products that previously were sold in America, but they no longer have access to that market. And so there are real risks to the global trading system, and ITAC has a critical role in protecting us from some of those risks in certain cases. And what I was questioning was whether there is a role or need for ITAC to get involved in incremental, company-specific, ad hoc, and piecemeal tariff decisions which it doesn't seem to be able to do particularly well based on the data that Donald and team have presented back to us. Yeah, on the reciprocal commitments, I share all of Donald's concerns and views, but I know he has looked into these in far more detail than I ever will want to. So let me rather throw that in his court.
Okay,
Yeah,
Donald, when you answer that, could you also include the permits as well? So yeah.
Happy to do so. So I don't think reciprocal agreements are a good idea. ITAC knows my views on this. I've been very clear. I think it's a bad idea because I don't think you should ever be in a position where you're negotiating policy one-on-one with a company. Just imagine for a minute, you're stopped by the traffic cop and you're into a complicated conversation on how much you need to give in order not to spend the weekend in jail. So you don't want that. Like, you want to know what the policy is, and the policy must be applied consistently. So I don't think the solution to it is sector-wide commitments. I think the commitments need to go. If there's merit in a decision to raise duties or reduce duties or whatever the case is, then you should do that. I don't think the answer to it is to try to haggle your way to a conclusion. And then regarding the permits, the permits are a big deal because we have all kinds of weird conditions that are added to permits. When you put out a new requirement for a permit, it doesn't go through Parliament, it doesn't go through the minister, it is done internally within ITAC. We've seen in ITAC's strategy plan, which is on their website, you can read it for yourself. They say there, for example, that Black economic empowerment conditions will be considered for future permits. Now, I'm not suggesting that's good or bad. All I'm saying is it's not something that was there at the time you applied for your rebate to be created. So this is the reason it becomes problematic. I mean, do we find a moment where you can only import steel if you have a BEE rating above a certain level? You can quickly see what a problem that would become. So that's the kind of thing that worries me, I guess, on the permit front. Yeah.
And then quick one before we just wrap up is there's a question. Are we seeing at the moment any kind of reciprocity or an increasing hostility with the US?
So I don't think personally that we're at any kind of risk of South Africa retaliating against the US. I think that would just straight up be a terrible idea. But having said that, I'm not entirely sure what on earth South Africa does to bring down the temperature with the US. A lot of what the US appears to be asking for are not things I believe the Minister of Trade can simply agree to. So I'm not sure what happens there, except that South Africa has to do the sensible thing and find other people we can sell to over time.
Okay. Well, thanks, colleagues. No, we have run out of time. I'm going to give Matthew an opportunity to have his parting shot, and then we'll end. But just to say thank you, Donald, Anneke, and the team for your work on this. I know that the team is very keen to continue to answer questions offline after the call, so all the questions will be addressed. Matthew, I just want to give you the parting shot. Donald and the team have their master plan. What are your recommendations or suggestions to address these matters, but also to develop a more cohesive and fit for purpose trade policy?
Cool. No, thanks, Mbongeni. So yeah, I mean, firstly, also just to respond to Kulkani's comment, and we've spent a fair amount of this afternoon, taking cheap shots at government, but I think this is one area where we need to commend government for being careful, mature, and so far doing the right things at a time when we all want to take our iPhones and chuck them in our Teslas and burn them down. The South African government has communicated well, has held the line, continues to engage and has not done anything stupid. So yeah, I think it's the right approach, and in this case, they should certainly be commended. I guess I also need to commend Donald and the XA team for their master plan. I absolutely agree that the South Africa's duty structure needs to be regularly reviewed. Agree that reciprocal agreements just smack of Trumpism and should also be revised or replaced or removed, and that our regulations need to be amended. The only perhaps additional steps that I would add to the Great XA Master Plan, one, as I indicated earlier, finding ways to shift away from these ad hoc piecemeal reviews and to conduct independent and holistic reviews of South Africa's tariff structure to deal with many of the challenges or problems that we've spoken about today, I think would be useful. And secondly, as I've suggested multiple times during this afternoon's discussion, I think we do need to rethink the role that ITAC should play when it comes to particular trade policy and tariff process decisions, and see if there's a way that we can get them to refocus on what is key, and to shift away perhaps from these tariff investigations. I mean, the added benefit of doing all of this is it will free Donald and his team to get over their obsession with tariff zombies and to turn their creative and intellectual abilities to other and perhaps more pressing trade and economic challenges. So over and back to you, Donald.
Yeah, he's lost a lot of hair, I think, over the years on this matter. But I mean, we just commend the work, and I mean, what's important about it is when you monitor and compile the overview, you give an opportunity to reflect on the trends, and an opportunity to raise the concerns in terms of the policy. So we do appreciate that, Donald.
Just maybe a closing comment. We would absolutely love to publish a report where there's significant improvement. And as loudly as I've complained about the zombies, we will absolutely as loudly scream about the improvements as these zombies are killed. So yeah, absolutely supportive. If it can shift direction, we'd be all over that.
Thank you very much. Is there anything upcoming that you want to at XA Global Trade Advisors that you'd like to highlight, Donald?
Well, we always have something on the boil. We're releasing a report on the customs union in a few weeks' time. Everyone here will get spammed with an invitation. We hope some of you will join, but we think an important problem to resolve is where to with the customs union. There's been a lot of media coverage about how much money is distributed to these other countries, and I think we're overdue for a conversation on what the future of the customs union holds. So those invites should be going out as soon as Nadia gets the design work done in the next week or two.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Matthew, for your inputs. Thank you, Donald, and the team for the reports. Thank you much to the audience for their time and their engagement. And we will attempt to answer all the questions offline. Thank you very much, colleagues. Enjoy the rest of your week.